"Marry me by Sunday or I lose this ranch," he warned, his voice flat with defeat rather than romance. And Clara Whitfield said yes, though not, as Jonas would spend the rest of his life believing, to save a roof over her head. Some promises are made to solve a problem. Others are made to finally stop hiding one. "Marry me by Sunday or lose the ranch," he warned. She said yes, but not for the reason he thought. There is a particular kind of morning that arrives before the sun does. Not gray, not gold, just gray. The kind of morning a man learns to move through by habit rather than hope. Jonas Reid knew that morning well. He had lived inside it for 3 years. He was awake before the rooster, awake before the frost had finished settling on the fence rails, awake before there was any reason at all to be awake, except that lying still gave his mind too much room to wander, and Jonas Reid did not trust his own mind with that kind of room anymore. He dressed in the dark. He always did. Boots, coat, hat, the same 3 motions in the same order every morning since his father died, as though the ritual itself were load-bearing, as though skipping a single step might bring the whole structure down. He did not look in the mirror on his way out the door. He never did. Not out of vanity and not out of neglect. Something quieter than either. A man who looks at his own reflection has to see whatever's looking back. And Jonas Reid had learned, the hard way, that some mornings he didn't recognize a man in the glass. Tired eyes. His father's jaw. A weight behind the eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, when the ranch was still just a ranch, and not the last surviving piece of man who no longer existed anywhere else in the world. The Reid Ranch sat at the base of Cedar Bend, 1,100 acres his father had carved out of raw Montana territory, with nothing but stubbornness and a mule that outlived him by a decade. It was not just land. It was proof that a man named Elias Reid had once stood on this earth and built something with his own 2 hands that would outlast him. And if Jonas lost it, he understood, with a clarity that sat cold in his chest most mornings, that he would be losing the last evidence that his father's life had mattered at all. That was a thought that followed him into town most Thursdays. It followed him in especially hard this one. The bank in Cedar Bend was a narrow brick building with a bell over the door that announced every visitor, whether they wanted to be announced or not. Jonas hated that bell. It rang the same cheerful note, whether a man walked in to deposit a harvest or walked in to be told he had none left to deposit. Today, it rang for the second reason. Mr. Calder, the bank's manager, was not a cruel man. Jonas had known him for years, knew his wife, knew his boys, had once pulled his wagon out of a ditch during a spring flood without being asked. Calder did not enjoy what came next. That much was clear in the way he folded his hands before he spoke. The way a man folds his hands before delivering news he wishes belonged to someone else. "Jonas," he said, "I've put this off as long as the board will let me." Jonas said nothing. He had learned that silence cost him nothing, and words lately cost more than he could always afford. The note's due in full. 90 days past what we agreed. I can't extend it again without something on paper that changes the terms. "There's nothing to change," Jonas said. "You know that." Calder hesitated, and in that hesitation, small, almost imperceptible, something shifted. "There's one thing," he said slowly, as though testing whether the words were worth saying at all. "Territorial homestead clause. Old one. Most folks don't know it's still on the books." He slid a paper across the desk, and for a moment Jonas didn't touch it. "A married household," Calder said, "gets 90 additional days on any foreclosure action. Law figures a family's worth protecting a little longer than a bachelor's investment." Jonas looked at the paper, then at Calder, then at the paper again, as though rereading it might change what it said. "I'm not married." "No," Calder agreed quietly. "You're not." He didn't say the rest out loud. He didn't have to. By Sunday, or none of this matters anyway. Clara Whitfield had been running the Reid household for a little over a year, and in that time, she had learned exactly 3 things about Jonas Reid that he had never once said aloud. She had learned he took his coffee black not because he preferred it, but because he'd stopped noticing what he preferred. She had learned he avoided the hallway mirror by the stairs entirely, walking a half-step wider around it every single morning, as though the glass itself might ask him something he wasn't ready to answer. And she had learned, slowly, carefully, The way a person learns the shape of a wound without ever being told how it happened. That Jonas Reid was a man carrying something heavier than debt. She never asked what it was. That was, in its own way, the reason she'd lasted longer in this house than any hired woman before her. She did not pry. She cooked. She mended. She kept his father's ledger straight and his mother's china dusted and his children's. There were no children, not yet, not ever now. And she had learned not to let herself finish that thought either. Clara ate her own meals standing at the counter, after his, alone. She retired early, before he came in from a barn. And when he asked her once why a woman as capable as she was hadn't married and settled somewhere with a family of her own, she had laughed, light, quick, practiced, and said something about preferring her own company, and changed the subject before he could look at her too closely. She was good at changing the subject before people looked at her too closely. She had learned that back east. The hard way. There was a Bible in the bottom of Clara's trunk, its spine cracked soft from years of handling, and pressed inside its pages, not marking any particular verse, just resting there, flattened and faded, was a single dried flower, a larkspur, pale blue once. She had told no one it was there. She touched it sometimes, late at night, the way a person touches an old bruise to make certain it's finished healing, and finds, more often than not, that it hasn't. The flower had been given to her by a man named Aaron Bell. 3 years and 2 states away, on an evening she had once believed was the beginning of her whole life. It had not been a beginning. It had been the end of one version of her and the quiet, humiliating birth of another, the version that learned in front of half a church congregation and a groom who never arrived, that being chosen and being wanted were not always the same thing. She had come west after that, not for adventure, for distance. And in a year of working in Jonas Reid's kitchen, she had built herself back into someone steady, someone useful, someone nobody in Cedar Bend had any particular reason to pity. She intended to keep it that way. She did not know, standing at the stove that Thursday evening with her back to the door, that the man walking in from town carried a folded paper in his coat pocket that was about to test exactly how steady she really was. He came in later than usual. Clara noticed it the way she noticed everything about that house. Quietly, without comment, filing it away rather than asking. His boots were slower on the porch steps. His hat came off slower, too, hung on its peg with more care than the moment required. The way a man handles small tasks when he's not ready to handle the large one waiting behind him. "Supper's on the stove," she said, not turning around. "There's coffee if you want it." He didn't answer right away. That, more than anything, was what made her turn. Jonas Reid was standing just inside the doorway, his hat in his hand, his jaw set in a way she had only seen once before. The week after the bank's first letter arrived, back before she learned not to ask about the numbers in his ledger that never quite added up the way he wanted them to. "Jonas, sit down a minute," he said. "Please." She sat. He didn't. He stood by the window instead, half turned from her, the same way he half turned from every mirror in the house, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, as though the words themselves were something he had to physically work up the nerve to lift. "Bank's calling the note," he said finally. "Full amount. By Sunday." Clara's hands went still in her lap. "I don't have it," he said. "Not close to it. Not after last winter's herd losses. Calder's known me 20 years, and he still couldn't find a way around it. Jonas, I'm sorry. There's one way around it." He turned to face her then, and something in his expression made the rest of her sentence die quietly in her throat. "One clause. Old territorial law. A married household gets 90 more days before the bank can act." The room went very quiet. "I'm not asking you because I thought this through proper," he said, the words coming faster now, rougher, like a man who'd rehearsed a speech and abandoned it 3 words in. "I'm not asking because it's right, or because you deserve to be asked this way. You deserve better than a man standing in his own kitchen asking you to marry him to save a piece of land." He stopped, swallowed, started again. "It isn't right to ask this," he said quietly, "but I'm asking it anyway." Clara did not move. Somewhere behind her ribs, something had gone very still. Not shock exactly, though shock was in it somewhere. Something closer to recognition, as though a door she had spent 3 years bracing shut had just been knocked on, gently, by the one man she had never once let herself imagine standing on the other side of it. She thought of the Larkspur press flat in the bottom of her trunk. She thought of the church back east, and the pews full of people who had watched her wait for a man who never came. She thought of every reason a sensible woman would take a full week to consider an offer like this one, weigh it, sleep on it, ask for time, and then she heard herself say, before he had even finished searching her face for an answer, "Yes." Jonas blinked. "Clara." "Yes," she said again, steadier this time, her voice giving away nothing at all of what was moving underneath it. "I'll marry you, Jonas. Sunday's fine." He exhaled something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite disbelief. Some third thing, caught between the two, the particular exhausted gratitude of a man who had expected to be refused and had no plan at all for being accepted. "Thank you," he said. "I know what this is. I know what I'm asking you to give up for a piece of land that isn't even yours." Clara said nothing. She let him believe what he needed to believe. She let him believe she had said yes to save herself a roof, a wage, a place to stand when winter came again. Because the truth sitting underneath her answer was something she was nowhere near ready to hand him, not on a Thursday evening in a kitchen still smelling of stew, not with the ink barely dry on a bank's foreclosure notice, not with her own heart only just now admitting to itself what it had apparently known for months. He took her yes for relief. She would spend the next 3 days praying he never asked her why she'd really given it. "Marry me by Sunday or lose the ranch," he warned. She said yes, but not for the reason he thought. There's a kind of change that announces itself, and there's a kind that doesn't, that moves through a house the way morning light moves across a floor, so gradually that no one could point to the exact moment it arrived, only to the fact that, somehow, it already had. That was the kind of change that settled over the Reid Ranch in the 3 days between Jonas Reid's proposal and the wedding no one in Cedar Bend had been given more than a week's warning to prepare for. Clara told herself nothing had changed at all. She rose at the same hour. She lit the same stove. She made the same coffee, black, the way he'd never once told her he preferred it and had simply stopped correcting. But there were tells, small ones, the kind only a woman watching her own hands closely enough would notice. She mended his shirt collar herself that first evening, rather than leaving it folded on the mending pile the way she always had. Sitting alone by lamplight long after he'd gone out to check the herd, drawing a needle through worn cotton with a care that had nothing to do with the collar and everything to do with the man who would wear it. She began sitting at the table for supper instead of standing at the counter. She stopped changing the subject. It was a small thing, hardly worth noticing on its own, but on the second evening, when Jonas asked, almost carefully, almost as though testing whether the question was still forbidden, why a woman like her had never married before now, Clara did not laugh it away this time. She simply said, "I almost did, once," and left it there. She did not explain further. He did not ask her to, but something passed between them in that unfinished sentence, small, wordless, the particular kind of understanding that exists only between two people who have each learned, separately, exactly how much a person can choose not to say. That was the same evening the Larkspur nearly disappeared from the world. Clara sat alone in her room that night, the Bible open across her knees, the pressed flower lying flat and faded against the page where it had rested, undisturbed, for 3 years. She lifted it out, held it for a long moment between her fingers. Thinner than paper now, the blue gone almost entirely to gray. She thought of Aaron Bell's face the last time she'd seen it. Not at the church. She had never actually seen him at the church. That was a particular cruelty of it. He had simply never arrived, but the week before, in a parlor, promising her a life he had no intention of building. She thought of every version of herself that Flower had outlived, and she thought, holding it there in the lamplight the night before she was to marry another man entirely, that perhaps it was time to let it go, that a woman standing at the edge of a real beginning had no business carrying the pressed remains of a false one into it. She walked to the hearth. She held the flower over the low fire, close enough to feel the heat reach for it, and then, for reasons she could not have named even to herself, she drew it back. She did not burn it. She placed it back inside the Bible instead, closed the cover gently over it, and set the book back at the bottom of her trunk, beneath the spare linens, exactly where it had always lived. Some wounds. She was learning. You do not have to destroy in order to outgrow. You simply have to stop needing them to hurt. Mr. Calder heard about the wedding the same way most of Cedar Hollow eventually heard about anything, through his own front counter, delivered secondhand by a customer who had no idea the news meant anything more to him than idle conversation. He rode out to the ranch himself the following afternoon, not to interfere, to warn. "I'm glad for you, Jonas," he said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and he meant it. That was the strange, uncomfortable truth of Calder's position in all of this. He was not the obstacle. He was simply the messenger standing closest to it. "I mean that, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you plain. The bank's going to look at this closely. Any marriage entered into specifically to claim that clause, if it's found to be." He hesitated over the word. "Convenient," he said finally, choosing it carefully. "Rather than genuine, the extension gets voided. Retroactively. You know the full note immediately. No 90 days, no grace." "It's genuine," Jonas said. Calder studied him for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. "But belief and proof aren't always the same animal, Jonas. Just be careful who else hears about this, and how. Word travels faster than truth does out here." He was right to say it. He simply didn't yet know how right. Everett Marsh arrived at the Reid Ranch 2 days before the wedding, uninvited, unannounced, and entirely unwelcome, though it took Jonas the better part of an hour standing in his own yard to fully understand just how unwelcome the visit was meant to be. Everett was a younger brother of Jonas's late wife, Sarah, a fact the town of Cedar Bend had mostly forgotten in the 3 years since her passing, the way small towns forget most things that no longer require active grieving. Everett had not forgotten. Everett, in fact, had spent 3 years believing himself the last living person obligated to remember Sarah Reid properly, now that her husband appeared to have moved on with unseemly haste. "Married by Sunday," Everett said, before Jonas had even finished walking out to meet him. "That's what I heard in town. Sarah's not even 3 years in the ground, Jonas. This isn't about Sarah, isn't it?" Everett's jaw was tight, his voice low with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat uncomfortably between the two. "You're marrying your hired cook to dodge a banknote. That's what I heard, word for word. It's more complicated than that." "Is it?" Everett stepped closer. "Or is that just a story a desperate man tells himself, so he doesn't have to look too closely at what he's doing to a woman with no better options than say yes to whatever you offer her?" Jonas said nothing. "I could write to that bank myself," Everett said quietly. "Tell them exactly what this marriage really is. A loophole with a ring on it. You'd lose the ranch either way, Jonas. At least this way, you wouldn't be dragging some poor woman down with you under false pretenses." He turned to leave. "Think on it," he said, over his shoulder. "You've got 2 days. He rode off without waiting for an answer, leaving Jonas standing alone in the yard with a threat that could unravel everything. Not through malice exactly. Jonas understood that much even through his own anger, through grief, through a man's own unresolved mourning, aimed at the nearest available target because the actual target, death itself, could not be confronted directly. That did not make the threat any less real. By the following morning, Cedar Bend had a new favorite subject of conversation, and it moved the town the way it always did. Through the mercantile, through church pews, through letters passed between women who considered themselves simply sharing news, never quite recognizing the weight their words carried once they landed somewhere else. Jonas Reid's cook, marrying him Sunday. To save the ranch, they say. It was not cruel, most of it. It was simply reductive. The particular, thoughtless cruelty of a story too complicated to explain being flattened down into one a small town could digest over pie and coffee. Desperate for security. Poor thing. Smart, if you ask me. Man's got 1,100 acres and no wife to run it. Wonder which one of them proposed first. Clara heard all of it secondhand, filtered to the careful, apologetic tone of the one woman in town who still thought to warn her rather than simply repeat it. She said nothing in her own defense. She could not correct them without explaining the truth. She had not yet found the courage to say to the one person who actually needed to hear it. So she let them believe what was easiest to believe. She had done it before. After all, she was, by now, very good at letting people believe the smaller version of her story. The night before the wedding, Clara went looking for Jonas near the barn, meaning only to tell him the linens were pressed and the parlor was ready for tomorrow's small gathering. She found him already occupied. Everett's horse stood tethered near the gate. Their voices carried to the half-open door, low, tense, neither man aware of how far sound traveled across a quiet yard at dusk. She should have announced herself. She did not. "I'm not doing this to hurt Sarah's memory," Jonas was saying, his voice tired in a way Clara had rarely heard it. "I need you to understand that." "Then why?" Everett said. "Are you doing it?" A long pause. "Because I need the ranch and Clara needs security," Jonas said finally. "She's got no family out here, no prospect of her own, nothing waiting for her if this arrangement falls through. It's a fair trade, Everett. She gets stability. I get 90 more days to fix what I can't fix alone. That's all this is. That's all this is." Clara stood frozen in the darkness outside the door, her hand pressed flat against the rough-wood siding, and felt something inside her chest go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. She had heard those words before. Different mouth, different year, different church, different town, different name, but the shape of it was exactly the same. A woman reduced, gently and without cruelty, to an arrangement, a convenience, a fair trade, offered by a man who could not quite bring himself to call it what it actually was, because naming it plainly would have meant admitting he owed her more than practicality. She had believed, once before, that a man wanted her for who she was. She had been wrong then. She was terrified she was about to be wrong again. She did not confront him that night. She was not certain, in that moment, what she would even say, how she would explain that the wound reopening in her chest had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a fear 3 years old, one she had never once spoken aloud to anyone in Cedar Bend, least of all the man she was set to marry in less than a day. She returned to her room instead. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and for the second time in 3 days, she reached for the Bible at the bottom of her trunk. She did not take the flower out this time. She simply held the book closed against her chest, the way a person holds something not to examine it, but to keep it from falling apart in their hands. Perhaps this is a mistake, she thought. Perhaps I am exactly as Everett fears, exactly as the whole town already believes. A convenience, a fair trade, a woman foolish enough to mistake a business arrangement for something it was never going to become. She was still sitting there, the lamp burning low, when a small voice spoke from the doorway. "Miss Clara?" Ellie stood at the threshold in her nightgown, 7 years old, Everett's daughter, sent to stay at the ranch that week while her father settled family business. He hadn't fully explained to a child too young for the details. Her mother, Everett's wife, had died that winter quietly after a long illness, and the girl had arrived at the Reid Ranch 3 weeks earlier, carrying a grief far too large for her small frame to hold alone. She had taken to Clara almost immediately. Clara had never quite let herself wonder why. "Can't sleep, sweetheart?" Ellie shook her head, crossing the room slowly, climbing up on the bed beside Clara, without waiting to be invited, the way children do when they've already decided a person is safe. "Papa says you're marrying Uncle Jonas because of the bank," she said quietly. "Because he needs the money rule thing." Clara's chest tightened. Some of it's true, yes." "I don't care why," Ellie said. She said it so plainly, so simply, that for a moment Clara couldn't find any words to follow it. "I don't care if it's the bank or the rule or anything else," Ellie continued, her small hands twisting in the fabric of her nightgown, her eyes bright in the lamplight with something far too old for her years. "I just don't want you to leave, like Mama left." "Ellie." "She didn't want to leave," the girl said, quieter now, the plain, devastating logic of a child who had already learned, far too young, that love does not always get to choose whether it stays. "But she left anyway. And everybody keeps talking about why you're marrying Uncle Jonas, and none of them are asking the only thing that matters." She looked up. "Are you a stay?" Clara sat very still, holding the small hand that found hers without either of them quite noticing, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what she had almost let a doorway and an overheard sentence talk her out of. It did not matter, in this moment, why Jonas had said what he'd said to Everett. It did not matter what the whole town believed or what practical word he'd used to describe her to a grieving brother-in-law who needed a simple answer more than he needed the true one. What mattered was the small hand in hers and the question sitting inside it, plain and unbearable and entirely unconcerned with bank clauses or fair trades. "Yes," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm going to stay." Ellie's face broke open into something like relief. Clara held on to that feeling for as long as she could. She would need it, because somewhere out past the barn, a man she loved had just described her as a fair trade to a brother who wanted an excuse to stop it. And tomorrow, in front of the whole town of Cedar Bend, she was going to have to decide whether loving him quietly was still enough, or whether the time had finally come to say the truth out loud, and risk everything to do it. "Marry me by Sunday or lose the ranch," he warned. She said yes, but not for the reason he thought. The wedding itself was small. It was, by most standards, hardly a wedding at all. A preacher borrowed from the next county over. A parlor cleared of its furniture and swept twice. A handful of neighbors standing in for a congregation that had not been given more than a week to prepare itself for the news. Clara wore blue, not white. There had been no time to have anything made, and she had not wanted white anyway, not for reasons she examined too closely. Jonas wore his father's coat, brushed and pressed the night before by hands that had not told him whose hands they belonged to. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Neither of them would remember much of it clearly. Afterward, not the preacher's exact words, not the particular slant of the morning light through the parlor windows, not even, entirely, the sound of their own voices agreeing to a lifetime neither had expected to be offered this way. What Clara would remember, for the rest of her life, was the moment Jonas took her hand to slide the ring onto her finger, his father's mother's ring, plain gold, slightly too large, and how his hands had trembled just slightly, in a way that had nothing to do with debt or clauses or 90 additional days. She told herself it meant nothing. She was, by now, quite practiced at telling herself things that weren't true. Sunday became Monday. Monday became a full week, quiet and strange and settling. The particular hush of two people learning to live inside a decision made too quickly to fully understand. Clara moved her few belongings from the small room off the kitchen into the room that had once belonged to Sarah Reid. A room Jonas had not slept in properly since his wife's death, though he had never once explained that to Clara, and Clara had never once asked. She found, on the third morning, that she did not mind sleeping in a dead woman's bed nearly so much as she'd feared she might. Grief, she was learning, does not resent the living for continuing. It simply asks to be remembered kindly along the way. She thought the worst of it, the doubt, the overheard sentence, the fear that had nearly undone her the night before the wedding, had passed quietly, the way most private storms eventually do. She was wrong. Everett Marsh had given his brother-in-law 2 days to reconsider. Jonas had not reconsidered, and a man who has already lost one person he loved to something he could not control does not, as a rule, take kindly to watching a second person disappear into an arrangement he believes is built on nothing sturdier than convenience. He had promised to think on it. What he had actually done in the 6 days since was write a letter. The letter reached Mr. Calder's desk on a Thursday morning, and Calder read it twice before he set it down, and sat with it a long while after that, the particular stillness of a careful man deciding how much of an unpleasant duty he is actually obligated to perform. The letter was not cruel. It did not accuse Jonas of fraud outright or Clara of opportunism. Everett Marsh was, whatever else he was, a man who chose his words with more care than his anger usually allowed him credit for. It simply raised a question, a reasonable one, on paper. A concerned brother-in-law's honest doubt about whether marriage entered into 6 days after a foreclosure notice between an employer and his hired cook could reasonably be called anything other than exactly what the territorial clause was designed to prevent people from claiming it as. I do not say this out of malice. Everett had written, I say it because someone has to ask the question before the bank simply assumes the answer. Calder folded the letter. He did not want to act on it. He also understood, with the same tired clarity that had made him warn Jonas kindly weeks earlier, that he no longer had a choice. The letter arrived at the bank offices requesting Jonas Reid's presence, Clara's as well, on the following Tuesday morning, to address, in Calder's careful written language, certain concerns raised regarding the circumstances of the marriage in question prior to the bank's board finalizing the extension terms. Jonas read it standing at the same kitchen table where, 10 days earlier, he had first learned the ranch might already be lost. Clara read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. He actually did it, Jonas said finally, his voice low, more disappointed than angry. I don't know what I thought, that he'd let it go once he saw we'd already married. He's not trying to hurt you, Clara said quietly. He's trying to protect something he already lost once. He just doesn't have the right target for it. Jonas looked at her. You sound like you understand him better than I do. I understand what it feels like, she said, to be so afraid of losing something again that you convince yourself attacking it first is somehow safer. She did not say anything further. She did not need to. Not yet. But the words sat between them for the rest of that evening, quiet and unfinished, the way certain truths do just before someone finally works up the courage to say them plainly. The bank's back office in Cedar Bend was not built for confrontation. It was built for ledgers, for quiet transactions, for the small, unremarkable business of a small, unremarkable town. And it felt, that Tuesday morning, entirely too small for the 4 people crowded into it. Mr. Calder sat behind his desk, a folder open in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in the particular way of a man who has made peace with being the least comfortable person in the room. Everett stood near the window, arms folded, his jaw set the way it had been in the yard 8 days earlier. Jonas and Clara sat across from Calder's desk, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though neither of them had planned it that way. I want to be clear, Calder said, addressing the room generally, though his eyes stayed mostly on his folder, that this isn't an accusation from the bank. It's a question raised by a concerned family member, and given the timing involved, the board requires it be addressed before the extension can be considered final. The timing was the whole point, Everett said. 6 days, Calder. A note comes due, and 6 days later there's a wedding. You don't need a law degree to see what that looks like. It looks like a man doing what he had to do to save his father's ranch, Jonas said, his voice tight. Does it? Everett turned to face him fully. Or is that just easier to believe than the truth? That you marry a woman with no better prospects because it solved your problem, and let her believe it was something more, because you needed her to say yes? That's not, isn't it? Everett's voice rose slightly, the grief underneath it finally surfacing to the anger, plain and raw. I heard you, Jonas. In the barn. Your own words. A fair trade. That's what you called it. Not a marriage. A trade. The room went very still. Jonas opened his mouth, to explain, to defend, to reach for the same practical language he'd used that night, without ever meaning for it to be overheard, without ever meaning for it to be the whole truth. Clara spoke first. May I say something? Calder nodded, somewhat startled. Everett's arms stayed folded, but his eyes moved to her, wary, waiting. Clara stood. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was steadier still. The particular calm of a woman who has spent 3 years learning exactly how much it costs to stay quiet, and has finally decided the cost is no longer worth paying. Mr. Marsh is right that the timing looks exactly like what he thinks it is, she said. A note came due. A clause existed. A wedding happened 6 days later. I understand why that looks like a trade to anyone standing on the outside of it. She turned, briefly, toward Jonas, who was watching her now with an expression she had never once seen on his face before, something between confusion and dawning alarm, a man realizing a moment was arriving that he had no way to prepare for. But I didn't say yes to save myself a home, Clara said. I had a home, a hard one, maybe, and a lonely one. But mine, and I could have kept it exactly as it was for as long as I liked without ever marrying anyone. Her voice did not waver. I said yes because I've loved this man since before he ever needed saving, she said. And I was too much of a coward to say so until he finally gave me an excuse good enough to hide behind. The room was utterly silent. I let him believe I said yes for security, she continued, because it was easier than telling him the truth, that I have watched him for a year, mending his shirts and keeping his ledgers and pretending not to notice the exact way he avoids his own reflection every morning. And somewhere in that year, without ever intending to, I fell in love with a man who has never once asked to be loved by anyone since he buried the last person who did. She looked at Everett. You lost your sister, she said more gently now. And you spent 3 years terrified that if Jonas moves forward, it means she gets left behind. I understand that fear better than almost anyone standing in this room could. But I am not erasing her, Mr. Marsh. I am simply choosing not to let grief be the only thing this family is allowed to hold on to. Jonas stared at her. The words hung in the small office between them. Simple and enormous all at once. The same words, Clara realized distantly, that she had rehearsed 100 different ways in her own head over the past 10 days, and had never once expected to actually deliver in front of a banker's desk and a grieving brother-in-law, instead of privately, quietly, on a porch somewhere with no witnesses at all. Clara, Jonas said, his voice rough, disbelieving. You never. I know, she said. I should have told you first. Not here. I'm sorry it happened this way. You love me. It was not a question meant for the room. He asked it anyway, in front of all of them, as though the presence of Calder and Everett had simply ceased to matter. I have for a while now, Clara said quietly. Longer than I've been brave enough to admit, even to myself. For a long moment, Jonas said nothing at all. Then something shifted behind his eyes. The particular, unguarded look of a man discovering, in the middle of the worst possible circumstances to discover it, that the thing he had assumed was a practical arrangement had quietly become the realest thing in his life. Everett was the one who finally broke the silence. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone, he said, quieter now, his arms unfolding, his anger visibly draining out of him and leaving something smaller and sadder in its place. I came here because I keep waiting for someone to tell me Sarah mattered, that she's not just a chapter somebody's ready to close. His voice caught. I watched you stop saying her name, Jonas, month by month, and I told myself if I just made enough noise, somebody would remember her the way I still do. I remember her every day, Jonas said, and there was no defensiveness left in it now, only exhaustion and grief, and something like relief at finally being asked directly instead of accused sideways. Loving Clara doesn't erase that, Everett. It never could. Everett looked at Clara for a long moment. I was wrong about you, he said finally, his voice thick. I thought you were a woman taking advantage of a bad situation. I see now I was looking at the wrong thing entirely. He extended his hand, and Clara took it. I'm sorry, he said simply, for all of it. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Standing in that small office 10 minutes earlier, an antagonist softened not by defeat, but by understanding. Mr. Calder cleared his throat, closing a folder in front of him with the particular relief of a man who has just watched an impossible morning resolve itself without requiring him to make a single difficult ruling. Well, he said, I believe that answers the board's concerns satisfactorily. The extension held. 90 days became the safety Jonas needed to sell off part of the North Pasture on his own terms rather than the bank's. To renegotiate what remained, to keep the ranch his father had built standing for however many more years he and Clara chose to keep it that way. But standing outside the bank afterward, in the ordinary daylight of an ordinary Tuesday, Jonas understood something he suspected he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. The ranch had never really been the point. It had only ever been the excuse he needed to ask, an excuse Clara had needed to finally answer. That evening, back at the house, Clara knelt beside her trunk and lifted out the Bible one last time. She took out the larkspur, pale, faded, 3 years dried, and held a long moment in the lamplight, the way she had a dozen times before. But this time, she did not consider the fire. She walked instead to the small frame on the parlor shelf, the one holding the single photograph taken hastily the morning of her wedding, and carefully, gently, she tucked the flower into the corner of the frame beside it. Not hidden this time. Displayed. A piece of a story that had ended badly, resting quietly beside a photograph of one that hadn't. Jonas found her there a few minutes later. He did not ask what the flower meant. He simply stood beside her, looking at the frame, and after a long moment, reached for her hand. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm glad the bank called that note. Clara laughed. Soft, surprise, entirely real. So am I, she said. He had asked her to marry him to save a ranch. She had said yes to save herself from a life spent almost loving him. And in the end, they had saved each other, and neither of them needed a bank's permission to call it real.